I would like to turn this over to our next speaker, Mayank Varia from Boston University. Mayank, as I mentioned, handles data and analytics and cybersecurity in a slightly different end of the pipeline here, and is very much focused on the applications of cryptography to allow us to learn in ways that actually protect the underlying data. And what I've been impressed with in a lot of Mayank's work is his application of this to public policy and broader public benefit as well. I will say, and I will also not read Mayank's bio verbatim, but will say that his work has also been widely acknowledged and widely featured throughout the popular press. There's been some partnerships with the city of Boston. He's currently serving on the U.S. Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building and the UN Privacy Preserving Techniques Task Team to promote the use of cryptography for data analytics to shape laws and policies. And I'm delighted that Mayank is here today to tell us about some of his stories on the development and application of some of his approaches. Mayank, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sean, for the very kind introduction. Just to check, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. So I'm excited to speak with you all today about my field of cryptography and how it offers a new and different way to conduct data science. So if you think about how data science works today, there's usually this tension that arises when organizations deal with sensitive data. Because on the one hand, the rise of big data and the accompanying advances in algorithms that process it offer incredible opportunities to improve society. But at the same time, everyone has also become a lot more cautious, and reasonably so, about data sharing because data breaches can cause personal, financial, legal, and political harms. So in this talk, I want to think about what if there were a different way to achieve the benefits of data science while also protecting privacy? In 2017, the US Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking envisioned a new system that they called a National Secure Data Service that would allow federal, state, and local government agencies to link their data sets and run statistical analyses on the joint data, but in a way that doesn't require storing the data in any central warehouse in the process. So this sounds like a paradox. How can agencies pool their information together if they don't share their data? And in this talk, what I wanted to discuss is a tool from cryptography called secure multi-party computation that allows people to compute over data they cannot see. And so by decoupling access to data from the ability to gain insights from it, what secure multi-party computation effectively does is it expands that Pareto frontier of data analyses that can be performed. That is, we can conduct data science in a way that simultaneously enhances the accuracy and quality of data analysis while also respecting personal autonomy and consent and enforcing data minimization and purpose restrictions. So how does it work? I'm going to explain how secure multi-party computation, or MPC for short, works with the aid of this quote from a recent US Senate bill. So MPC allows several participants to work together. They could be individuals, companies, or governments. I'm just going to refer to them as data holders because they each possess some data set. But the goal is they want to keep their data private. They don't want to upload it to any kind of data warehouse. Jumping over to the other side of the pipeline, the data holders would like to compute some function of their aggregate data and reveal that result to either one of them or somebody else. This function could be a statistical analysis, it could be a database query, it could be a machine learning classifier, or anything really. And they want to get from point A to point B in a way that keeps their data private along the way. This is kind of a form of data alchemy. We want to build a black box where you can put garbage in and yet still have valuable data come out the other side. To achieve this goal in MPC, the data holders will split their data into encoded pieces and send them to different servers that I'm going to call the computing parties. Anybody can serve as a computing party. And there's only one rule here, which is that the data holders must collectively trust that the computing parties are not all working together against them. This is because with MPC, as I'll show you later, the computing parties collectively do have the ability, if they all pool their information, to reconstruct all of the data holders' data. But as long as they're not all working together against the data holders, we can mathematically prove that nobody will learn anything in this protocol beyond its desired output. So the upshot here of MPC is that the most computationally powerful and technologically savvy entity can also be the least trusted one. And this is pretty much the opposite of how data science works today. So one caveat before we continue, while MPC protects all inputs and intermediate state in a calculation, it does reveal the output of the calculation, that's the goal. And as a result, it also reveals anything that could be inferred from the output, and I mean that in a Bayesian sense. So I'm not going to discuss any kinds of inference concerns in this talk. That's a separate question for disclosure limitation tools like differential privacy. The good news here is that these two techniques are symbiotic. You can securely compute a differentially private metric. And if you do that, differential privacy will protect the output itself, and MPC will protect the process of getting there. Okay, so in this talk, I want to describe two applications of modern cryptographic tools like MPC. First, to compute the gender and racial wage gap in the city of Boston, and then to build a system that can securely match sexual assault reports to determine repeat offenders. And then in the second part of my talk, I want to discuss how the machinery of cryptography can provide a new lens through which we can view legal questions involving cybersecurity and government power. Okay, so the first deep dive is into the work that I and many of my colleagues at Boston University have done with the city of Boston. We've used MPC to measure the gender and racial wage gap for the past 6 years using real salary data representing about 1 in 6 employees in the greater Boston workforce, and all without the need to share any payroll data. We've done this work in collaboration with the Boston Women's Workforce Council. They're a group that's dedicated to eliminating the gender and racial wage gap in our city. The council has established a pledge that has since to date been signed by approximately 300 companies in the greater Boston area. The pledge has a bunch of goals. One of them, and the one I'm going to focus on here, is a measurement component, which says that the employers should jointly compute the overall citywide wage gap every 1 or 2 years so that the city holds itself overall accountable for moving towards a world with 100% equal pay for equal work. So, but in implementing this measurement component, the council ran into a conundrum. So how can the Women's Workforce Council compute the citywide wage gap while keeping employers and employees' data anonymous? They initially tried to find a trusted third party who would serve as a data repository and hold on to all this information, but they couldn't find anyone who would be willing to take on the liability risk involved with having all this sensitive salary information. And this is where MPC comes in. We've collaborated with the Women's Workforce Council from 2015 through 2021 to measure the wage gap 5 different times. You can read the resulting citywide metrics calculated from this analysis in the published reports on the Women's Workforce Council website. I have the URL here, but you cannot read any individual employer or employee salary data because we never collected them. So one reason that we've been successful in designing and deploying this software is that we've purposely designed the entire system to provide value to all of the different stakeholders involved in this data analysis, from the Women's Workforce Council itself to the participating companies. So within the participating companies, there's a lot of stakeholders. The technologists and IT staff at the participating institutions were mostly concerned about questions of comprehension, transparency, and auditability. They needed to be able to understand, first, that it's possible to do what we claim, that this isn't just some weird magic box. And second, that our software actually protects their data rather than somehow secretly collecting it all behind their back. And one of the most useful features of MPC here is that it's actually very simple to describe, as I'll show you in just a few minutes. We've also made all of our source code available, and it's small enough, it's just a few hundred lines of code that IT staff at participating institutions can actually check that it works correctly. Second, the lawyers at the participating institutions that we spoke to were mostly concerned with questions involving liability and non-disclosure agreements. I could give a whole talk on this separately, but I won't here. Suffice to say that we were able to convince our senior administration at Boston University to sign these kinds of non-disclosure agreements precisely because MPC ensures that we were never learning anything anyway. Third, our partners at the Boston Women's Workforce Council itself, their main goal was to get accurate, error-free data representing as large a fraction of the Boston workforce as possible. And for them, MPC turned out to be quicker, cheaper, and safer than finding a trusted third party to hold on to the data. And finally, the human resource employees and diversity officers at the participating institutions, the people who actually use the system that we built, they just wanted an accessible and simple experience so they could enter their company's payroll information and just move on with their lives. And so to support these goals of accessibility and reducing errors, we've worked with human factors experts to design an easy-to-use website containing a normal web form, a normal-looking web form in a format that the target audience that uses the system was already familiar with. So behind the scenes, though, this website has two special features that are different than most sites. First, there's a bunch of JavaScript code so that the client's own web browser will proactively check for different kinds of common data entry error issues. So proactively warning the employee if the data looks anomalous before they hit the submit button. And second, the site acts very differently after the employee hits the submit button. Unlike a normal web form, the data itself doesn't actually go anywhere. So I said before that the system is easy to explain, so let me show you how it works. Just to make things simple and fit on a single slide, I'm going to consider a smaller scaled down version of the wage gap project, where let's pretend there are only 2 participating data holder organizations that participate in the study, and there are 3 different computing parties that will store encoded pieces of their data. Also, let's zoom in on one of the cells in the spreadsheet. There's a big spreadsheet. We ask a bunch of data for the companies. This first one here happens to ask for the number of female Latina executives at the member institution company. Let's call the employer's individual answers to this question A and B respectively. So the goal here is for the Women's Workforce Council to learn only the sum of these 2 numbers, A plus B, and everyone else should learn nothing. To accomplish this goal, each company will split its data into pieces that are useless individually and only valuable collectively. So these pieces are just individual numbers that are each uniformly chosen at random, subject to the constraint that they add up to the company's real secret. So each company sends 1 piece of their secret to each of the 3 computing parties. So now from the perspective of any single party, they've learned nothing because all they hold is a random number. And yet collectively, the computing parties do have enough information to compute the sum A plus B, because that's just the sum of all the 6 numbers that I've drawn a box around. And we're going to take advantage of the fact that addition here is commutative. It doesn't matter if we first add the numbers vertically and then horizontally, or in the other direction. And so let's go in the other direction. What we'll do is have each computing party add the 2 numbers that it holds and give just that result to the Women's Workforce Council. So each of those numbers individually is also uniformly random, and it doesn't reveal anything about A or B individually, so it preserves the data holder's privacy. And yet, it also has the property that it allows the Women's Workforce Council to calculate what they want. They can add these final numbers together to reconstruct the sum A plus B. This is precisely what our web-based software is doing behind the scenes. It just does it rather than for 2 companies, for more than 100 participating employers in each study, and also for each of the 600 or so cells inside this spreadsheet. So in a similar fashion, it's also possible to compute the product of 2 numbers, A and B, in a way that protects all data, but that's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to skip the details in the interest of time. And because addition and multiplication are Turing complete, that means in principle, it's possible to build any calculation from them. So you could run MPC over any analytic of your choice, but that's not always the best way to proceed. Okay, switching gears a little bit. In the second part of my talk, I want to discuss some customized protocols that I and other cryptographers have designed to safeguard information in specific scenarios involving sensitive data. So in this part of the talk, I want to discuss a long-running collaboration that several of us in the crypto community have had with Callisto. Callisto is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping survivors of sexual assault on college campuses. Inspired by the Me Too movement, what Callisto envisioned was a system that would allow multiple survivors of a repeat sexual offender to be matched together so that they can act afterward with a common, stronger voice. So I've collaborated extensively with Callisto to design a matching system that has the workflow that I'll show on this slide. So first, a survivor logs into the system and they submit a report that includes the name of their offender. And then a lawyer, working together with a part of Callisto, learns when 2 people have named the same offender. Under attorney-client privilege, the lawyer can then contact the survivors and have a discussion about possible next steps. The most important part here is that no information is revealed to the lawyer until a match occurs, and no information is revealed to Callisto itself ever. So all 3 of these steps of login, report, and match are delicate due to the extreme sensitivity of the information involved. Actually, the login piece is the trickiest part of them all. And that's because, unlike with a normal login system, for us, it's important that even Callisto itself has no idea who has logged into their service. Because even that fact is super sensitive information. Anybody who logs into Callisto is likely to be a survivor of sexual assault, and we want to protect even that information from being revealed to anyone. But in the interest of time, though, for this talk, I'm going to focus on the other two pieces, the reporting and matching steps. It turns out that login can be implemented using a more complicated version of some of the same building blocks that I'll describe there. So here's how the reporting system works for Callisto. Imagine for the moment that there exists this strange black box, and it operates in the following way. If you submit into this box the name of an offender, it will return the coefficients of a line, like an actual geometric line in 2D space, in response. So I recognize the way that I've described it, this black box is bad because it would learn the name of this offender. But it turns out that just this problem is not too hard to fix. We can fix it with standard public key cryptography to build a different version of this box that will do the exact same functionality, but without ever learning the offender's name. But I'll skip the details for now. So, okay, why would we even want such this black box? So in this example, Alice has submitted the name of her offender, Zeus. So she receives back this blue line in response. What does she do with it? She's going to submit two things to the lawyer's database. First, she'll just randomly choose a point on this blue line. And second, she'll submit an encryption of her assault report. Now, importantly, the key that she uses when encrypting her report is the y-intercept of the blue line, the blue key that I've drawn on the slide. Okay, on its own, this information is useless to the lawyer. There are infinitely many lines that go through Alice's point, and so the lawyer has no hope of figuring out what was the correct key, the blue key, and therefore no hope of decrypting the report. So let's say a second person, Bob, submits a report next, and it happens to be the case that he names the same offender. This black box has the property that it's deterministic. If two people name the same offender, they're going to get the same line back in response. So Bob will also receive this blue line, and he's going to perform the same action that I just said for Alice. So he's going to choose a random point on this line and submit that along with his encrypted report, encrypted under the blue key. The important thing to remember here is the line is determined entirely by the name of the offender, whereas the point selected on the line was chosen independently by each survivor and therefore unlikely to be the same. So because 2 points uniquely determine a line, at this point, the Callisto lawyer has enough information to interpolate the line, recover the key, decrypt Alice and Bob's reports, and begin an investigation. So let's see what happens if another person, Carol, comes in and names a different offender, in this case, Poseidon. The way this box works is if you name a different offender, you're going to get back a different line in response. So say Carol gets this orange line back. She'll do the same action as before. She'll submit a randomly chosen point on this line together with an encrypted report to this lawyer, this time using the orange key. But because the lawyer only has 1 point so far on the orange line, there isn't enough information in the system for the lawyer to reveal Carol's record. Even those prior reports submitted by Alice and Bob don't help us out here because the orange line is effectively independent of the blue line from before. If the lawyer tries to interpolate Carol's point with either Alice or Bob's, that will result in the wrong line, the wrong key, and Carol's record will not decrypt. And that's basically the entire system. The system, as designed, allows survivors to report instances of sexual assault and to be notified by a lawyer if a match occurs so that they can talk through appropriate next steps. The full report and matching system has a few extra features and optimizations beyond what I've shown here, but the punchline remains the same. The lawyer cannot read a report unless 2 people name the same offender, and Callisto itself never learns anything throughout the entire process. Great, so those are 2 examples of using MPC in situations that have social benefit. I'm going to switch gears a bit for this final part of my talk and discuss connections between our social rules and values as codified within the law and the capabilities of computing sciences like cryptography. So concretely, for the rest of the talk, here's the specific question I want to examine. Can the police force you to enter the passcode to unlock your phone so they can read the underlying decrypted data? Law enforcement agencies are actually increasingly turning to this tactic because it's one of the few ways for them to recover encrypted information. In the United States, the government's compilation power is limited by your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and there's a ton of case law about that. But it turns out there's no good way, unfortunately, to extrapolate from that previous case history to the question of compelled decryption. And this ambiguity is baffling our court system right now. In just the past 2 years, there have been 4 different state Supreme Courts in Indiana, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania that have issued rulings about compelled decryption, and they are currently divided as to the answer of whether this is compellable. Legal scholars believe that the Supreme Court is likely to take up at least one of these cases in order to resolve the split of lower courts. So since looking at precedents doesn't seem to help resolve this problem, what Sarah Scheffler and I did in this Usenix security paper was to investigate the core legal principle at the heart of these cases. So I'm going to describe this principle, and then looking ahead, I will then present a mathematical definition for this principle and use it to reason directly that the answer to the compelled decryption question should be no. In this case, the government is not allowed to compel. But I think the logic that we use is a lot more important and interesting than the final answer. Basically, our argument shows that cryptography contains the machinery to resolve some of the ambiguity that it has created. So in order to proceed, I need to say a few details about the Fifth Amendment. So the privilege against self-incrimination in the United States covers actions, among other things, that are testimonial, where testimony means it discloses the contents of your mind. So I know I said there was a huge state of flux about this question of compelled decryption, but the general theory of testimony is very well established in the law. So first, an action is deemed to be protected testimony, and therefore something that the government cannot compel, if the output of an action directly reveals the contents of your mind. So for example, if the government compels you to write down how you committed a crime, that is direct testimony and it is never allowed. Additionally, an action can also be protected even if its output isn't testimonial, but from viewing the output, it is possible to infer something about your beliefs based on the way you went about performing the action that was compelled. So as an example, suppose that the government compels you to give them your house key, but only if you committed a crime. The output itself, your house key, has nothing to do with your mind, but whether you choose to hand it over to them does implicitly reveal your beliefs about the underlying crime. And so that's protected too. However, there's a loophole here. The government can compel an action anyway if its implicit testimonial aspects are what's called a foregone conclusion, meaning they add little to the government's information. So to give an example, suppose now the government compels you to give them your house key, but this time with no strings attached. Technically speaking, that does require the use of your mind to remember where did you leave your house key. But as long as the government has evidence that your house key exists and that you know where it is, then they aren't learning anything new from a testimonial standpoint. So this action is compellable, even though it technically has some minor use of your mind. And this piece right here is where compelled decryption cases get stuck. With compelled decryption, the result of the action, meaning the contents of your phone, that's not direct testimony. That has nothing to do with your mind. The act of typing in the passcode to your phone does require the use of your mind. And so it remains to figure out whether this question is a foregone conclusion. So let's zoom in on this part of the legal doctrine in more detail. The burden of proof in these cases falls on the government to demonstrate to the court that a compelled action adds little or nothing to the sum total of the government's information. That's a direct quote from the 1976 Supreme Court case, Fisher versus US, that introduced the foregone conclusion doctrine. So let's unpack this text a little bit. So first, what does it mean? What exactly is the government's information? I can think of at least 3 ways to define this. It could mean the stated evidence that, like, the government actually submits to the court in a brief while arguing that the action that it's requesting is a foregone conclusion. There's an even broader category of all information that law enforcement currently knows, whether or not it has revealed this to either the court or the defense. And there's an even broader category still of all potential information that the government could know if it went out and did more gumshoe detective work, starting from the submitted evidence. And this foregone conclusion text, it might refer to any of these 3 choices. Since I'm ultimately going to argue that no, the government cannot compel decryption, I'm going to choose the most generous interpretation of the rule that would make the most information compellable. So I'm going to propose that we declare an action to be a foregone conclusion as long as the implicit testimony is contained within this largest set of potential information. Okay, next, let's examine what it means to add little or nothing on top of the government's information. So this means that the government's knowledge after the compelled action must still remain within this potential information set. So by contrast, our definition will disallow any compelled action if the testimony would reveal information even more than that. So given how expansive we already made the potential information set, the only information left in the world are things that intrinsically rely on the contents of the defendant's mind to add information that the government couldn't possibly have known otherwise. So my foregone conclusion rule is going to be that the government can compel stuff in the potential box, but not in the larger total box. So this brings us to the central question that I want to think about in this remaining part of the talk, which is how do you ask the government to prove a negative in court, that they don't learn stuff in the bigger gray box? So the key insight of our work is the observation that these legal questions of implicit testimony and foregone conclusions are remarkably similar to the style of definitions that we use every day in cryptography, where in designing systems like secure multi-party computation, we also want to prove a negative, that you don't learn anything new as a result of running this computation. And so what we want to do is take those mathematically rigorous concepts and of proving a negative and use them in understanding the foregone conclusion doctrine. So using the style of definitions, something in cryptography called simulation. So here's how it works. Here's the definition that we made for codifying this foregone conclusion doctrine. I'm going to emphasize up front before going into the details that this definition is going to agree with all major US Supreme and Appellate Court decisions involving foregone conclusions. So we think it's a reasonable interpretation of the relevant law here. Okay, so the definition proceeds as a thought experiment. Suppose you take on the role of a judge deciding a case, a compelled decryption case, and we imagine what might happen both if you choose to allow the compelled action and if you choose not to allow the compelled action. So first, let's think about what happens if you do allow the compelled action. In this case, the government will interact with the defendant as prescribed, and the government may also continue doing its investigation, query other people or objects in the world. I'll collectively refer to the rest of the world as nature. So suppose the government then shows you the result of what it's learned. This information might add something to the sum total of what the government knew beforehand, or it might not. At the moment, we really cannot say. On the other hand, imagine an alternative or simulated reality in which you decided to decline the compelled action. So in this simulated reality, law enforcement can continue investigating on its own. Let's even give this simulated government the superpower to look at any information in nature, i.e. the rest of the world. It can even explore places outside of a real government's legal jurisdiction or search warrant limitations. I'm not even going to worry about that for the purpose of this conversation. The only restriction I'm going to make here is that in the simulated reality, the government cannot use the defendant's mind. So as a result, by construction, all of its knowledge must be contained within that smaller set of potential information, the kind that we said was acceptable to be a foregone conclusion. If it doesn't interact with you, its answer can't reveal something about your mind. Now, suppose you, as the judge in this mental experiment, compare the results that you receive in these two worlds, and they look identical to you. And it's not just you. Suppose you ask all your friends, and it looks identical to any other person who would serve as a judge as well. This is where the magic happens. If nobody can tell the difference between these two worlds, then there cannot be more information gained in the real world than in the simulated world. And this is precisely how the government can prove a negative, that even after interacting with the defendant, its information remains in that smaller potential set that we said was allowable as a foregone conclusion. So this concept of simulation, as I said before, it permeates modern cryptography. It's what we use to learn, to prove that nobody learns anything after running an MPC protocol, for example. So in this paper, Sarah and I show that this mathematical definition that we built, it agrees with several US Supreme and Appellate Court cases involving the foregone conclusion doctrine. In fact, we can actually go line by line through some of the case decisions and map the judge's rationale, why they came to the decision they did, onto this definition. Okay, so with the definition in hand, we can return to this question of compelled decryption. And in the paper, we analyze the compellability of many other actions as well. So the punchline of what we show is that decryption is generally not compellable under our definition. The real government, when working with a defendant, can decrypt the message, but the simulated government only sees the ciphertext, and due to the way that encryption works, it has no idea how to produce anything that looks like the plain text message. And so these are distinguishable events, and so our definition says this is not a foregone conclusion. But there's an important caveat to what I just said, which is I described sort of the textbook, very clean mathematical notion of how encryption works. But encryption in the real world is messy. It usually offers a bunch of extra features that either improve security or usability. So things like, hardware two-factor tokens or account recovery from tech support. While all of these are like reasonable cybersecurity practices in general and can actually be good overall and strengthen security against non-governmental actors, unfortunately, they have not been designed with the specific threat of compelled decryption in mind. And so if these features exist, then our definition says that the simulated government has a way to recover the secret plain text, and therefore the two outcomes are indistinguishable, and so decryption can be compelled. So the punchline here is that our paper demonstrates the need for the cybersecurity community to create new features, new security features that are designed with compelled decryption in mind. There's actually another way to think about our definition, and it reveals even more cybersecurity challenges. So far in the talk, we've been discussing whether I can be compelled to perform an action in the present based on evidence that the government has gathered, based on whatever I have voluntarily done in the past. But what if we flip this around? What if we ask the following question? When going about my normal daily life, what actions should I be taking to reduce the evidence that I leave available, and therefore lower my risk of being compelled in the future? We can use our definition to reason about this question as well. So here's a thought, since I spent the first half of my talk talking about MPC. What if we use that to safeguard proactively all of our information, right? We saw in the first half of this talk that MPC is an incredibly powerful tool that can help people to get things done without leaving a data trail. Unfortunately, there's a catch. Remember that MPC had just one cardinal rule, which was that the computing parties were not allowed to collude. And the government can break this assumption using its compelling power. Because the Fifth Amendment only protects against self-incrimination, the government could compel those encoded pieces or shares of your data from all of those computing parties, which in our definition live in nature. And as a result, it can reconstruct the defendant's secrets. This tactic will work for effectively all MPC protocols in the literature because, again, they weren't designed with this compelling threat in mind. But that's okay, though. Now that we're aware of this problem, we can fix it. So in the paper, we show how to design a new MPC protocol that is resilient in the sense that it provably does not create new compellable actions, no matter what existing evidence that the government might have already had against you. And furthermore, it meets all the usual traditional crypto guarantees we want against non-government adversaries. So to summarize, in this paper, we analyze the extent to which existing crypto systems are vulnerable to the threat of government-compelled actions, and we propose new schemes that provide stronger resilience in the face of this power. This analysis is based on our cryptographic model of the law surrounding the government's power to compel, which agrees with major court decisions in this arena. Okay, so to wrap up, in this talk, I've described three potential uses of cryptographically protected computing using MPC, measuring the wage gap, identifying repeat offenders of sexual assault, and safeguarding personal information against government-compelled actions. There's a common takeaway from all these parts of the talk that I want to leave you with, which is that secure multi-party computation enables people to derive collective knowledge while keeping their individual data siloed and away from anyone else's visibility. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of how cryptography can change data science. In principle, this technology has the potential to upend some of our existing notions of what is data ownership or custody or jurisdiction or disclosure or liability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayank. This is really cool work. Thank you for taking the time to describe this. Are there any quick questions now that that folks would like to ask at this point? I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask at least just one at this point, Mayank, and I've got another couple, I think, at the end for you actually as well. But for now, I've got a similar question to what I had for Stefan, which is, at least for some of this work in which you are applying your approaches to these public data sets, one to the work with the city of Boston, another one for the survivors of sexual assault. These are, as you point out, straightforward, but still bespoke solutions, it seems. And I'm curious, there are so many different organizations and situations that could benefit from these kinds of techniques, is there a light at the end of the tunnel to generality of these tools in a way that allows the broader application of them? Or is this just all going to come down to you have to be a cryptographer to do this right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the cryptographic community is working very hard to put ourselves out of a job to make it so that it is possible for anyone to use these tools. I guess I'll say maybe a non-answer here, but in response that from what I've found, the hardest challenge with using MPC is not usually applying these tools or even customizing these tools, like general purpose software off the shelf. Like there's more than 2 or 3 dozen different open source tools for doing secure multi-party computation from different academic and industry groups. Usually that's not the main challenge. The challenge is usually in finding a problem, a scenario where everyone wants to use this tool. I don't mean because of like, oh, I don't understand it or whatever. I mean, that's an issue too, but I meant like in terms of incentive alignment. So you have to find a problem where the data are sensitive enough that you don't want to just, share it in the clear with each other or outsource it to a trusted third party, but not so sensitive that you wouldn't even want to reveal predicates about this data, that there's nothing about it you'd want to reveal, and you really just do want to keep it siloed and not even compute over it. So a nice feature about, for example, the Women's Workforce Council work is that it was broadly agreed by everyone that learning this citywide gap, this one predicate about all of our data, is socially valuable. No one really disputed that, right? Like we all had common agreement on this, the city employees, us building the system, all of the participating institutions, and yet there was a sensitivity issue about the underlying source salary data. So finding those applications where the incentives make it so that this is the right tool to use, that's probably the biggest challenge to use. And related to that, the fact that most people don't know that the tool exists, so you can't ask for something that you don't know it exists. But those are probably the 2 biggest challenges. There are questions about, for example, how fast does it run and how easy is it to use? Those are important questions too, and I'm sure we'll get into it more. But those are usually secondary to just finding the right scenario where it's even in principle the right tool to use.
Thank you, Mayank. That's great. That's very interesting. I would like to ask you more about the social aspect, perhaps at the end of this session here as well, since I think that's a common thread to a number of the talks